Edith Cobb was 50 years old, and she was standing in the Millbrook Grange Hall on a Saturday evening in October, and George Halsey was telling her, in front of 11 other people, who were all pretending very hard to be discussing something else, that he had reconsidered. He said it carefully, the way a man says something he has rehearsed. He said, "Mrs. Cobb, I want you to know I think very highly of you. But I've been giving this more thought, and I believe a man in my position, starting a new chapter, ought to start it with someone a bit more, well, suited to a long future. I'm sure you understand." Edith understood exactly what he meant, because George Halsey was 46 years old and had spent the last 3 months courting her with what had seemed, to everyone in Millbrook, including Edith, like genuine and sensible intent, and what he meant by a bit more suited to a long future was a woman younger than 50, and what he meant by "I'm sure you understand" was that he expected her not to make this difficult. She did not make it difficult. She said, "Of course, Mr. Halsey. Thank you for telling me directly." And then she picked up her shawl from the back of the chair, and she left the Grange Hall, walking. In the October evening, the 1.5 miles back to the homestead she had run alone for the past 4 years, since her husband Walter died of a heart attack while mending a fence in the spring of 1883. I want to pause here, because what I want you to notice is not the rejection itself, which is unpleasant, but not on its own remarkable. What I want you to notice is what George Halsey said next, after Edith had left, to the small group of people standing near him, because this is the second hook, and it is the thing that matters. George Halsey, watching Edith walk out the door with her shawl and her composure entirely intact, said to the group, in a slightly lower voice but not low enough, 4 years running that place alone, and you'd think a woman would be glad of the help. But I've heard she's particular about how things are done. It doesn't take well to a man's opinion on his own household, from what I gather. Better to know that now than later." Mrs. Pruitt, who was standing closest and who would later repeat this conversation, word for word, to at least 4 people, including, eventually, Edith herself, said afterward that she had thought, in that moment listening to George Halsey explain why a woman who had successfully run 400 acres alone for 4 years was unsuitable because she might have opinions about her own household. That George Halsey had just told the entire room something true about himself, and had not noticed he'd done it. Walter and Edith Cobb had come to Montana Territory in 1879 from Iowa with a homestead claim and the kind of optimism that the territory either rewarded or did not, depending on the year. Walter was a careful man, methodical, the sort who kept records of everything, and in the 4 years before he died, he had built a working cattle operation on 400 acres that was, by the standards of the area, modest but sound. When Walter died in the spring of 1883, Edith was 46 years old, with no children, and a homestead claim that, under territorial law, she was entitled to retain as his widow provided she continued to meet the residency and improvement requirements. I have looked at the Montana Territory homestead records from this period, held in the Helena Archive, and the administrative reality for a widow in Edith's position was considerable. She had to demonstrate continued occupation, continued cultivation, and file the appropriate proofs at intervals, all while running the actual operation, and a significant number of widows in this position lost their claims within 2 years, not because they could not do the work, but because they could not manage the paperwork and the work simultaneously, particularly if they could not read well or had no one to advise them. Edith could read very well. She had kept Walter's books for the entire 4 years of their marriage in the territory because Walter, while methodical, did not enjoy the bookkeeping and had handed it to Edith in the first month, somewhat apologetically, and had never taken it back because she was better at it than he was, and they both knew it. So when Walter died, Edith already knew the operation in its entirety, in a way that many widows in her position did not, because she had been doing half the actual management for years without it being called that. She filed the proofs herself. She hired on two hands for the seasonal work she could not do alone. She kept the ledger, which by 1887 was a 4-year record, in Edith's careful hand of every transaction the Cobb homestead had made. Cattle bought and sold, supplies purchased, wages paid, down to the penny. In a ledger book that Walter had started in 1879 and Edith had continued without a single gap. This ledger is, in a sense, the central object of this story, though it does not look like much. It is a plain book with a worn leather cover, and it sat on the desk in the front room of the Cobb homestead, and anyone who looked at it would see, in 8 years of entries, a complete record of a person who had been quietly, competently running something for a very long time, first alongside a husband, and then alone, without a single year of loss. George Halsey had never looked at the ledger. George Halsey had arrived in Millbrook the previous year, from Ohio, with some money from the sale of a business there, and had purchased a parcel of land adjoining Edith's, and had begun, over the summer, the process of courting her with what had appeared to be sincere intent. Though I think, looking at what came after, that George Halsey's intent had been sincere in the sense that he had genuinely wanted what he thought he was getting, which was a capable woman to run a household he did not yet know how to run himself, on terms that he had not fully examined. What George Halsey discovered over 3 months was that Edith Cobb had opinions about fencing, about the timing of the fall sale, about a drainage issue on the boundary between their two properties that Edith had identified correctly and George had initially dismissed and then, expensively, had to address exactly as she had described. George Halsey did not enjoy being correct about by a woman, and he had not, until the Grange Hall, fully admitted to himself that this was the actual source of his reconsideration. Thomas Reyes was 53 years old, a widower of 6 years, and he ran the largest operation in the Millbrook Valley, 1,100 acres, with the kind of quiet competence that did not announce itself. He had been at the Grange Hall on the Saturday in question, sitting near the back with a cup of coffee, and he had heard everything George Halsey said, both to Edith directly and afterward to the group. Thomas had known Edith Cobb for 8 years, in the way that neighbors in a sparse valley know each other. Not intimately, but with an accumulated familiarity built from small interactions over a long time. He had bought cattle from the Cobb operation twice. He had, the previous winter, sent one of his hands over to help with a fence repair after a bad storm, the kind of thing neighbors did without making anything of it. He had, on several occasions over the years, found himself at the same gatherings as Edith and had noticed, the way a careful person notices things, that she was the kind of person who listened more than she spoke, and that what she said, when she said it, was usually worth the wait. In March of that year, 7 months before the Grange Hall, Thomas had been at a meeting of the Valley's ranchers regarding a proposed change to the grazing arrangements on the shared range to the north. The meeting had gone on for some time, with most of the men present talking over each other, about a complicated proposal that nobody had fully worked through. Edith, who had come because the proposal affected her grazing rights as much as anyone's, had sat quietly for most of it. Near the end, when the discussion had reached the kind of circular impasse that happens when too many people have opinions and not enough have done the arithmetic, Edith had said, "If I've understood the proposal correctly, this would actually reduce everyone's available grazing close to a fifth in a drought year because of how the rotation falls. Has anyone worked out what that would mean for stocking numbers?" Nobody had. There was a silence. Then someone had gone and gotten the proposal documents, and they had worked through it, and Edith had been right, and the proposal had been revised before it went to a vote. Thomas had not said anything at the time, but he had noticed. He had noticed that Edith had sat through 40 minutes of men talking past each other, had identified the actual flaw in the proposal, had stated it plainly and without any flourish, and had then gone quiet again once the point was made, not needing to be thanked or acknowledged for it, beyond the practical correction itself. He had thought about that meeting more than once in the months since. Not in any way he would have described at the time as romantic interest, more as a kind of ongoing observation. There goes a person who is careful and correct, and does not need anyone to notice that she is careful and correct, which is, Thomas had come to think, one of the rarer qualities a person can have. When George Halsey began courting Edith over the summer, Thomas had noted it the way you note a piece of news about a neighbor, without any particular feeling attached. He had thought, if anything, that it seemed like a reasonable match on paper. Two people of similar age, both managing land, both recently without a spouse. He had not examined why exactly. He found himself slightly relieved when, in September, one of the Pruitt children mentioned that Mr. Halsey and Mrs. Cobb seemed to be having more disagreements lately than agreements. At the Grange Hall, when George Halsey said what he said, both to Edith and afterward to the group, Thomas Reyes sat very still with his coffee and did not say anything. But something in him, which had been quietly accumulating for 7 months without his full attention, arrived in that moment at a kind of clarity. He watched Edith Cobb walk out of the hall, with her shawl and her composure, having just been told in front of 11 people that her competence and her opinions made her unsuitable for a long future, and he thought, that man has just described, with complete accuracy and no idea what he was saying, exactly why I have been thinking about her for 7 months. I think it is worth saying something about why Thomas had never acted on this accumulating observation before that evening. Thomas Reyes was, by nature, a careful man, and careful men in his position were often slow to act on anything that involved another person's reputation, particularly a widow's, because territorial communities of this size watched such things closely, and a man who showed interest too early, or too visibly, risked making the woman in question the subject of exactly the kind of speculation that could complicate her standing rather than improve it. Thomas had decided, without ever stating it to himself in these terms, that he would rather wait and be certain than act and create difficulty for Edith where none needed to exist. There was also the matter of George Halsey himself. Thomas had known for most of the summer that Halsey was courting Edith, and Thomas had told himself more than once that it was not his business, and that if the match suited Edith, it suited her, and that his own occasional thoughts on the matter were not the kind of thing a decent man dwelt on, regarding a neighbor who had made her own arrangements. He had been, in his own estimation, entirely correct to stay out of it. What he had not anticipated was that the arrangement would end the way it did, in a public room, with a reasoning so transparently small that it left no ambiguity at all about what kind of partnership Edith had nearly entered into, and what kind of partnership she had not. Edith Cobb walked the 1.5 miles home in the October dark without crying, which was not, for her, an effort of will so much as an accurate description of how she felt. She was not devastated. She was, if she examined it honestly, mostly tired and a little embarrassed. And underneath both of those things, something that she identified, by the time she reached her own gate, as relief. She had spent 3 months with George Halsey doing something she had not done since Walter died, which was adjusting. Adjusting her opinions to be offered more gently. Adjusting her schedule around his visits. Adjusting on at least 2 occasions her actual correct assessment of a problem, because saying it plainly had produced a reaction she found tiring to manage. She had told herself this was what courting required, a kind of softening, and she had been doing it without much enthusiasm, and had told herself the enthusiasm would come. Walking home in the dark, she thought, I have not had to adjust anything for 4 years, and I built something good in that time. And I just spent 3 months making myself smaller for a man who, it turns out, wanted me smaller than I was willing to actually become. And that is, perhaps, useful information. She went inside, lit the lamp, and did the evening accounts in the ledger, as she did most evenings, because the cattle did not care about the Grange Hall, and the books needed to be current. The familiar work settled her, the way it always did. I find this small detail worth dwelling on, because it tells you something about Edith that the rest of the evening does not. A woman who had just been publicly set aside by a man she had spent 3 months courting could reasonably have spent that evening in any number of ways, in tears, in anger, in the kind of restless replaying that humiliation often produces. Edith opened the ledger instead and recorded the day's transactions, in the same hand she had used for 8 years. And the entries for that evening look on the page exactly like the entries for any other evening. There is no mark of what had happened at the Grange Hall anywhere in the book. Edith had decided, in the time it took to walk home, that George Halsey's opinion of her would not be permitted to enter the one record that mattered most to her, and the ledger in its silence on the matter is perhaps the clearest statement she ever made about how little weight she intended to give it. The next morning, Mrs. Pruitt arrived at Edith's door before 9, which Edith correctly interpreted as meaning that what George Halsey had said after Edith left had made its way through the valley overnight, the way these things did, and that Mrs. Pruitt had decided Edith ought to hear it from a friend rather than from gossip. Mrs. Pruitt told her, word for word as best she could recall it, what George Halsey had said about Edith's opinions and her household, and the man's better-to-know now framing. Edith listened without much visible reaction. When Mrs. Pruitt finished, slightly breathless from the telling, Edith said, "Well, I suppose that settles whether I'd have been happy in any case." Mrs. Pruitt said, "I'm sorry, Edith. He's a fool." Edith said, "He may be, but he's not wrong that I have opinions about my own household. He's only wrong about what that means." She poured Mrs. Pruitt a cup of coffee, and the two of them sat for a while, and Mrs. Pruitt, before she left, mentioned, in the manner of someone passing along a piece of information without making anything of it, that Thomas Reyes had been very quiet at the Grange Hall, and had left not long after Edith did. Edith said, "Did he?" Mrs. Pruitt said, "He did." Neither of them said anything further about it. But Edith thought about it, off and on, for the rest of the day, in the way you think about a small fact that does not seem to require thinking about, and yet keeps returning. Thomas Reyes did not come to eat this homestead immediately. He thought about it for several days, in the careful way he thought about most things, because he was aware that arriving too soon after the Grange Hall would look like exactly the kind of thing he did not want it to look like. A man swooping in on a rejected woman, treating her as a consolation or a convenience. He waited 11 days. When he came, it was a Wednesday, midday, and he came on the pretext of discussing the boundary fence, which was a real and ongoing piece of business between their two properties, and gave him a legitimate reason to be there. Edith was in the yard when he arrived, and she greeted him with the same straightforward courtesy she extended to most people, and they discussed the fence for a while, standing at the gate, and the discussion was sensible and specific, the way conversations between two people who both understood ranching tended to be. When the fence business was concluded, Thomas did not leave immediately. He stood for a moment, and then he said, "I was at the Grange Hall. Edith." I heard what Halsey said, both parts of it. Edith said, "I assumed most of the valley had heard by now." Thomas said, "I wanted to say something about it, and I've been turning it over for 11 days about how to say it, so I'll just say it plainly, because I think that's how you'd prefer it." Edith waited. Thomas said, "Halsey said you have opinions about your own household, and that this made you unsuitable for a long future. I've known you 8 years, Edith. I've watched you run 400 acres alone since Walter died, without a single bad year that I'm aware of. I watched you back in March, sit through 40 minutes of men talking in circles, and then say one sentence that fixed the whole proposal, and not need anyone to make a fuss about it afterward. I don't think your opinions are a flaw in your suitability. I think they're the most useful thing about you, and any man who can't see that isn't looking at the right things." Edith was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's a lot of careful observation for 8 years of being neighbors, Thomas." Thomas said, "I suppose it is. I hadn't fully added it up myself until the Grange Hall." Watching Halsey describe exactly what made you valuable as though it were a defect. Something about that put it together for me all at once. He paused. Then he said, "I'm 53. I've been alone 6 years since Margaret died, and I've managed well enough, the way you've managed well enough. But managing well enough isn't the same as the alternative, and I think I'd like to ask you something if you'll let me, though I understand if 11 days is too soon, or if you'd rather not, given everything." Edith looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Ask me, Thomas. I'd rather know what the question is than spend the afternoon wondering." Thomas said, "Would you consider, in time and at whatever pace makes sense to you, the idea of the two of us together? Not as an arrangement, exactly. As something closer to a partnership that includes, I hope, the other parts too." Edith said, "That is a very carefully worded question. Thomas Reyes." Thomas said, "I've had 11 days. Edith almost laughed. She said, "Yes, I'd consider it. I'd like to consider it properly, the way you've clearly been considering it. Come back Sunday. We can discuss the fence again if anyone asks why you're here, and we can discuss the other thing as well." Thomas Reyes and Edith Cobb married the following spring, 8 months after the Grange Hall, in a small ceremony at the Millbrook church that both of their operations hands attended, along with most of the valley, including, at a slight distance, and with what observers described as a carefully neutral expression, George Halsey, who had not been invited but had not been excluded either, because Edith had decided that excluding him would give the matter more weight than it deserved. The two operations were combined under a single management, though Edith kept her own ledger, running as a separate record for the first 2 years out of what she described to Thomas as simple thoroughness, and what Thomas understood correctly as Edith wanting to be certain, in her own records, in her own hand, that the thing she had built alone remained visible as its own accomplishment, even as it became part of something larger. On the day of the wedding, Edith made one entry in the old ledger, the one Walter had started in 1879, in the same careful hand she had used for 8 years of entries. It was not a financial entry. Underneath the last transaction from the previous week, she wrote, "Married Thomas Reyes today. The operation continues." Then she closed the book and put it on the shelf, and started a new one the following Monday, because the old one was nearly full in any case, and some things end not because anything went wrong, but simply because they have run their course, and a new chapter, as George Halsey might have put it, has begun. Edith never saw George Halsey's version of events, but Mrs. Pruitt reported some years later that he had remarried a woman considerably younger, and that within 2 years the Halsey operation had run into difficulties that a more careful set of books might have caught earlier. Edith, when she heard this, said only, "Well, I hope it works out for them," and she meant it mostly, in the way you can mean something mostly.